Every beast, monster and creature from the Tolkien universe explored. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. Tolkien's universe is fantastical, wonderful and terrifying at the same time. The enormous world building of Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is still regarded as a literary marvel, not simply in the history of fantasy books, but all over. Even the smallest creatures from Middle-earth, who very briefly appear in the books or the movies, have a full past that connects to others and gives readers of the books and viewers of the films a complete sense of the world. In fact, even though he never lived to see the films, Tolkien thoroughly set up the visual adaptations to succeed on screen with his descriptions, sketches and meticulous notes. The creatures are definitely one of the main attractions of this universe, although some might make you shiver in fear. Here is every single beast, monster and creature from the Tolkien universe. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Glaurung, the Great Worm. Glaurung, the Great Worm, is to longworms what Ancalagon the Black is to flying dragons. He was the biggest, deadliest and most lethal non-winged dragon that had ever existed. He was actually the only dragon to ever defeat Ancalagon. Morgoth's first attempt to create the perfect weapon was Glaurung, and boy was he successful. Glaurung was the earliest of the dragons and one of Morgoth's most important lieutenants in the First Age. Although the precise date of his creation is unknown, he initially appeared in Angband in FA 260 during the Siege of Angband. His initial attack forced the Noldor from Ardgallen, which he captured and desecrated, to Dorthonion and the Eredwethrin, despite the fact that he was still a young dragon by the standards of the long life of dragons and hadn't yet reached his full strength. This triumph was fleeting though, as Fingon rode against Glaurung with a company of mounted archers, forcing him to return to Angband. Because Glaurung had exposed himself while still young, Morgoth was not amused and forbade further incursions from Angband for 200 years. In FA 455, the siege of Angband was lifted in the Battle of Sudden Flame, known as the Dagor Bragolach. Now fully grown, Glaurung conquered the Noldor League by commanding the biggest army of orcs and balrogs ever gathered. After slaying some of their horsemen on the plain of Lothlan and forcing his way through Maglor's Gap, he advanced on the Feanorians and set fire to the entire area between the arms of Gelion. In FA 472, a counterattack was launched during the pivotal conflict of the Near-Ninth Arnoediad, the Unnumbered Tears. The Union of Maethros marched en masse against Angband. Early on the third morning, Glaurung and his family joined the conflict, but the dwarves overcame him as the dwarf lord heavily injured Glaurung's belly. In the most fateful of his battles during the fall of FA 495, Glaurung commanded an orc army that attacked Nargothrond. He crossed over Angfauglith and then attacked the North Vales of Sirion before wreaking havoc on Aethel Ivrin and Talath Dirnen in the south. No one could stop him, so he established himself in Nargothrond, demolishing the bridge and, in true dragon fashion, sleeping on the vast treasure he had looted, savouring his victory. Glaurung ruled over what was once the realm of Nargothrond for the following several years, winning over many orcs to his cause. He was ultimately killed by Turin, but even in death he had accomplished his goal of completing the doom he had woven for the Hurin children. Both of them committed suicide, dying soon after Glaurung met his end. In addition to his ability to spit fire and mist and destroy towns with his sheer immensity, Glaurung was also capable of mind control, memory erasure, and spell casting with just a single glance in your direction. Ungoliant. Ungoliant is arguably one of the deadliest animals that have ever lived. Remember Shelob, the tremendously powerful gigantic spider that Frodo came across? Well, she's a lineal descendant of Ungoliant. Shelob, however, isn't even close to the mother of spiders in terms of size, strength, bloodlust, or appetite. Her ancestor is definitely much more powerful and scary. The history of Ungoliant is obscure. She isn't included among the known Ainur, although it's believed that she may have been one of the Maiar or a lower spirit whom Melkor corrupted in the past. She is also supposed to have originated from the gloom that hung over Arda, which has led some to speculate that she might be a manifestation of the emptiness or darkness itself. What is known is that she had abandoned Merlkir during the Years of the Trees and had been living on her own in Avathar. Ungoliant isn't your average enormous spider. It's said that this creature is created entirely of darkness, has a voracious appetite, and prefers light to all other foods. Because of her extreme hunger, Ungoliant was readily persuaded by food, which is how Merlkir exploited the spider to eat the 2 trees of Valinor. Upon realizing that she had been used, she tried to devour Merlkir, but was beaten back by the Balrogs. After that, she hid in the Ered Gorgoroth in Beleriand out of terror. She had numerous children there, including Shelob, who spread throughout the Ered Gorgoroth and gave it a reputation for being a terrifying place. She also made an attempt to infiltrate Doriath, the kingdom of Thingol, but the Maya Melian's magic stopped her. Ungoliant herself eventually vanished from history, but it's unclear what exactly happened to her. It's said that she travelled to the forgotten south of the globe just before the First Age, and some claim that she ultimately allowed her ravenous appetite to overpower her and consumed herself. Scatha the Worm. Dragons are arguably the most powerful creatures to have ever existed in Tolkien's world, as well as the most evil and cunning. Dragons can be classified as either winged or non-winged. The longworms, which are non-winged creatures, were sleek, slender and enormous, resembling giant lizards. They had a tremendous desire for riches and power, accumulated enormous quantities of gold, and were very intelligent and able to talk. Given that both kinds of dragons were quite impossible to destroy, it's difficult to determine which was more powerful. One of the largest longworms that plagued the Grey Mountains in the north of Middle-earth was named Scatha. Before his emergence in the Third Age, little is known about his existence. The dwarfs and men who lived in the territories north of Wilderland were severely tormented by Scatha, whose lair was in the southern slopes of the Grey Mountains, and he had taken a considerable quantity of their treasure. The Eotheod Lord Fram, son of Frumgar, killed him. Peace returned to the region once Scatha was killed, with the exception of a disagreement over his looted gold. The loot was claimed by the local dwarf population. However, Fram refuted their assertion and sent them the dragon's teeth, saying, "Jewels such as these you will not match in your treasuries, for they're rare to come by." It was believed that the dwarves killed him in retaliation for this insult. It appears that at least a portion of the trove was kept by Fram's people, and Eorl brought it with him when he moved to Rohan. After the War of the Ring, many centuries later, Eowyn gifted Merry Brandybuck the Horn of the Mark, which was supposed to have originated from Scatha's treasure. Scatha the Worm was presumably the longworm version of Smaug in terms of strength and wealth throughout history. Scatha makes an appearance in a flashback when telling the story of Fram and the Eotheod in the Lord of the Rings online game, where it's shown that Fram swore vengeance and spent 2 years hunting Scatha after he attacked Framsburg and mangled Frumgar's sword arm. The player discovers Scatha's hoard's remaining items, which Fram was unable to transport with him in the present. Smaug. The Third Age's most powerful fire-breathing dragon was Smaug. In fact, one of the dragons that plagued the Grey Mountains was undoubtedly Smaug. Although his origins are unclear, Gandalf seemed to think of the dragon as young when he first entered Middle-earth's history in TA 2770. He was thought to have become old and strong by 2941. He notably has scarlet and green flames. In TA 2770, he assaulted the town of Dale and the Lonely Mountain. He drove Thror, king under the mountain, and his people into exile while claiming ownership of the mountain's treasure. Smaug was killed by Bard in TA 2941. He was able to slay the dragon by aiming the black arrow squarely at his left breast, which served as a vulnerable spot. Smaug destroyed Esgaroth as he fell by colliding with it. Thorin and company declared the treasure to be theirs by birthright after Smaug's passing. This led to a dispute with Bard and the Elven King of Mirkwood, who each demanded a share of the loot as restitution for the severe harm that Smaug had caused them. Thorin was adamant about keeping the loot to himself and had every intention of fighting for it against the men of Esgaroth and the elves of Mirkwood. The Battle of Five Armies was, however, sparked by the surprise Bolgian onslaught which united the free peoples of Middle-earth. Following the battle, Bard received Bilbo's 14th share of the treasure and sent a part of it to Lake Town to assist in its reconstruction. A new Lake Town was established further north after Smaug's death. However, Smaug's remains could be seen from the shore, and the locals were always terrified of them. Thus, they dared not enter the water to rescue the gems or riches. Like other dragons, Smaug is described by Thorin as a particularly greedy, powerful, and malicious worm who loves to hoard gold and has an in-depth understanding of his own collection, as shown by his quick identification of the missing cup. He's quick to lash out in defense of his own wealth, but he also demonstrates a fierce intellect and a curious fascination with deciphering Bilbo's cryptic origins. He has immense pride and vanity in his armor and arrogance in his own invulnerability, laughing at the idea that the dwarves could get their revenge. Should Sauron have made Smaug his vassal, these traits would have made him a dangerous servant. Ancalagon the Black. The greatest of all winged dragons was Ancalagon, often known as the Black. Morgoth created him during the First Age. Ancalagon the Black was a horrible being who was used as Morgoth's most powerful weapon because he was so nasty. It's unclear how big he was, but you only need to know that when he died and plummeted from the sky, his corpse flattened an entire mountain range. An entire range, not a single mountain. He was by far the biggest winged dragon that had ever existed. Ancalagon commanded Morgoth's army of fire drakes during the War of Wrath, which pitted Melkor's ancestors against the Valar before becoming corrupted. The host of Valinor waged war on Morgoth and wiped out his troops after Eärendil made his pilgrimage to Valinor to persuade the Valar to topple Morgoth and save the outmatched and vanquished elves in Edain. As his last and most potent weapon, a fleet of flying fire drakes commanded by Ancalagon, Morgoth unleashed it in the face of certain defeat. The troops of the Valar were pushed from the gates of Angband by their fierce assault, which is said to have been accompanied by a tempest of fire, enormous thunder, and lightning. But Eärendil, accompanied by a myriad of the Eagles of Manwë under the command of Thorondor, sailed out of the west in his blessed ship Vingilot. For a day, Ancalagon and the other dragons were engaged in battle with the Eagles and Eärendil. Eärendil eventually triumphed, hurling Ancalagon down upon Thangorodrim and causing the volcanic mountains to collapse in his fall. Ancalagon's demise signaled the fall of Morgoth's last line of defense. The Watcher in the Water. J.R.R. Tolkien characterized the Watcher in the Water as a terrifying and enigmatic creature with many tentacles, living in a stagnant pool or lake next to the west gate of Moria, which was built by damming the Sirannon River. Where previously the high road allowed travel between Ostin Edhill and Khazad-dûm many years earlier in the Second Age, the water had steadily grown deeper and crept closer to the doors of Durin, leaving only a short path. Some claim that the creature itself built the dam over a long period of time. Gandalf's observation that ancient, fouler monsters than orcs dwell in the depths of the world led people to believe that the Watcher had come from under Moria. The Watcher consumed Owen when his scouting party went to the West Gate during the dwarfs' attempt to colonize Moria once more. The Silmarillion states that all of Morgoth's servants detested and avoided the water and would only travel by sea if absolutely necessary. However, the Watcher appears to be malicious, which suggests it may be acting independently of the Dark Lord, similar to Smaug and other dragons from the same age. The creature's entire shape is unknown, but its visible components were its long, sinuous, light-emitting, pale green tentacles with fingered ends. In fact, not a lot is known about the beast in general. Even Gandalf was unaware of what the Watcher was or how widespread its kin was. In Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, the Watcher in the Water is depicted as a highly realistic computer-generated creature. In the film, Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took annoy the Watcher by throwing rocks into the lake to pass the time, as Gandalf tries to figure out the password to enter Moria. Also, interestingly, despite Tolkien's description of the beast having 21 tentacles, Peter Jackson gave it only 12 that could be seen. This is because the effects team found that rendering 21 tentacles accurately proved challenging. The Watcher is also portrayed as a Nessie-like monster with numerous limbs in the video game adaptation of the novel. Durins Bane. One of the Balrogs, otherwise unknown, was called Durins Bane. He was famous for having lived through the War of Wrath. The Balrog, who the Fellowship of the Ring encountered, was the one who killed King Durin IV and destroyed Moria after waking from his long slumber deep below the Misty Mountains. He was awakened by the dwarves of Moria in the Third Age. This Balrog was initially created as a Maya, but like other evil spirits, it quickly followed Morgoth to Arda and engaged Manwë. It's unknown if this Balrog served under Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, and in which battles of Beleriand he participated until the end of the First Age. This Balrog, however, managed to escape Thangorodrim's fall, run to the east, and hide in the Misty Mountains' roots beneath Khazad-dûm, when the host of the Valar vanquished the armies of Morgoth in the War of Wrath. The Balrog hibernated in Khazad-dûm's deep cave at the mountain roots for more than 5 millennia, before being awakened in TA 1980 by the mithril miners of Dwarf King Durin VI. He was unperturbed for the entirety of the Second Age and the majority of the Third. The beast then killed Durin, earning him the title of Durins Bane. He ruled over Moria for 500 years while terrorizing the dwarves. There were numerous attempts by the orcs and trolls to colonize Moria again, but they all failed because of the Balrog's dreaded power. In the long-gone dwarven realm, whose nature was unknown to the outside world, Durins Bane continued to be a threat. On their way to Mount Doom in January 1319, the Fellowship of the Ring passed through Moria and arrived at the bridge of Khazad-dûm on January 15th. They came across the terrifying beast there, and the elf Legolas recognized it as a Balrog right away, while Gimli dropped his axe in amazement after realizing it was Durins Bane. The wizard Gandalf immediately told the Fellowship members that this creature was beyond them and gave them the order to go while he battled it. Although Gandalf was able to vanquish him, they were both evenly matched. The epic struggle caused Gandalf to lose his life. However, he was eventually returned to Middle-earth as Gandalf the White and given considerably more might, all thanks to Durins Bane. Fell Beasts. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien has enormous ferocious flying creatures known as fell beasts, also known as hellhawks and Nazgul birds, in all 3 of its volumes. They have also appeared in many of Tolkien's literary adaptations. They're larger than any other flying creature and have wings, a beak and claws, and almost resemble prehistoric birds. The fell beasts are characterized as being large, winged monsters without feathers that resemble dragons in appearance. They had pinions between horned fingers, and their bodies were said to reek horribly, emanating a foul stench. The exact origins of this beast are unknown, but it's said that the Dark Lord Sauron bred fell beasts, which were enormous winged creatures that resembled dragons for use in battle, specifically to provide the Nazgul with mounts. Before Sauron started breeding them for battle, Tolkien claims that they were animals that were leftovers from an earlier world. They've been referred to as wraiths with wings, blacker than the pits in the night. In the movie versions, fell beasts are portrayed to be more like wyverns, which are serpentine, dragon-like animals with 2 legs and 2 wings. Tolkien undoubtedly intended a pterosaur-like creature, but in the movie, their heads look more like snakes, and they lack beaks which are described in the novel, leading to the widespread mistake that they're dragons in the books. The fell beasts maintain their roots in the Peter Jackson and Weta Workshop movies, which are very similar to those in the books. The Nazgul were given these flying mounts by Sauron. They're also far more powerful in the movies in comparison to their novel counterparts. The Return of the King depicts the fell beasts as being able to snare numerous Gondorian troops in their talons before releasing them to their doom during the siege of Osgiliath. They were capable of inflicting major damage, and regular horses stood no chance against them. Incredibly strong, they had enough strength to be able to easily maul regular horses and even humans to their death. Definitely not a creature I would ever like to come face to face with. Great Eagles. The eagles in the Tolkien universe were gigantic birds that Manwë used as his messengers and spies. Among them were the Great Eagles, enormous birds that could speak and were intelligent. They frequently aided mankind, elves and wizards in their fight against evil. They were also commonly referred to as the Eagles of Manwë and were devised by Manwë Sulimo, king of the Valar. They were dispatched to Middle-earth by Valinor to keep a check on the banished Aldor and their enemy, the wicked Valar Morgoth. They often helped men, elves and wizards in their quest to defeat evil, and could often be seen perched on top of high mountains overseeing all there is to see in Middle-earth. Their appearance is similar to that of a regular eagle, but they weren't much larger in size. The eagle isn't a friendly bird, and some of them are harsh and cowardly. The greatest of all bird species, however, was the ancient race of eagles of the northern mountains. They were proud, powerful, and noble-spirited. With a 180-foot wingspan, Thorondor is reputed to have been the largest of them all. For a while, Tolkien thought of the eagles as Maiar in the form of birds. However, the idea that a Maiar like Thorondor could have progeny ran counter to later theories. Tolkien then came to the conclusion that while being higher-level animals, the great eagles, Huan and other intelligent creatures were still just animals. The eagles were first thought of by Manwë during the music of the Ainur and manifested before the awakening of the elves, according to a later account. Except for the gloom of Morgoth's foul pits, they had the power to see through all solid objects. Before the huge fortress of Utumno fell, Morgoth first learned the boundaries of their sight. Interestingly, the eagles are smaller in Peter Jackson's cinematic trilogies than they are in the original book. With a wingspan of no more than 75 feet, they've been measured at about 20 feet tall. Additionally, it's not indicated that the birds can speak in the film adaptations. Shelob. In The Lord of the Rings and throughout Tolkien's writing, his spiders have always given readers nightmares. Try to picture a Black Widow. That's already pretty scary, huh? Imagine seeing one that's approximately 5 times larger than you. Shelob, a colossal demonic spider, is just that. Shelob's early life is largely unknown, with the exception of the belief that she was the final child of Ungoliant, the giant demonic spider, and that she was born in the Ered Gorgoroth. She frequently dined on her own offspring by the Second Age, and it's noted that she did so sometime after abandoning Beleriand, long before Sauron claimed the land of Mordor for himself. She's been around for a long time. She then created a sinister lair in the Ephel Duath in Cirith Ungol. She lived there for many years, weaving webs in a maze-like pattern across a system of caves to better catch her food, which comprised both large and small animals. She preyed largely on people who strayed into her webs, though she would stealthily pursue and kill something if it seemed like a particularly delectable treat. Shelob was living in the mountains during the Third Age, and Sauron was aware of her presence there as she made a good, if unintentional, guard for the Cirith Ungol Pass. She had a reputation for being somewhat beloved by Sauron, who even jokingly referred to her as his cat. Sometimes Sauron would offer her food in the form of prisoners whom he no longer needed, or servants that had offended him. To further amuse the Dark Lord, news of Shelob's massacre would be brought back to Barad-dûr. Additionally, she occasionally consumed the orcs who guarded the tower of Cirith Ungol. However, Sauron never made a conscious attempt to stop her, as she was a more efficient guard for the pass than they were. On their way to Mordor, Sam and Frodo would come across Shelob, who would initially render Frodo unconscious with her venom, before Sam killed her with Frodo's mithril blade, Sting. Shelob possessed several eyes, spindly legs, and deadly venom like other spiders do. She normally paralyzed her prey with her sting so she could eat them whenever she pleased, but she could also quickly drop on them and crush them to death. She had several missing eyes and numerous scars crisscrossed her skull. According to the orcs, she usually paralyzed and trapped her victims in webs, keeping them alive for a while before killing them. Giants. One of the enigmatic Middle-earth races that are only briefly referenced in Tolkien's work is the Giants. Giants are typically mythical creatures. However, none of these legends has survived, and the origin and history of the Giants are unknown. What we do know is that Gandalf the Grey was famed for narrating tales about dragons, goblins, and giants. Bilbo had heard of giants in tales. It's unknown if the giants could be killed or even injured for that matter. The giants are essentially simply enormous mountains when they're asleep, and you'd never know they were even alive. However, 2 giants were depicted in The Hobbit, playing around and hurling enormous rocks at one another, which were large enough to instantly smash a small hamlet. Tolkien didn't really give them much attention in his books, and only gave them a maximum height of 100 feet. For The Hobbit, Peter Jackson reinvented them as enormous mountains that had absolutely no interest in any other creatures, as they were unbothered as Bilbo and the dwarfs passed by them without incident. The Gondor natives had a local myth that giants lived in the seaside regions to the north of the Bay of Belfast, Belfalas. To prevent men from settling on their territories, they built the White Mountains. Tarlang, one of them, fell and fractured his neck. However, the other giants did not remove his body, which later became a part of the landscape. The head and the 2 stones the giant was carrying at the time of his death became Kulvaleg and Kulbin, while the giant's neck took on the name Tarlang's Neck. When Minas Tirith was standing on Amon Tirith, it appeared as though giants had carved the city out of the rock. In the late Third Age, the stone giants inhabited the Misty Mountains. Before the giants arrived, there were enormous bears who lived in the mountains. The giants apparently enjoyed tossing rocks at one another and then listening to them break amid the trees as they fell into the depths below them. In order to restore safety to the high pass in the Misty Mountains, Gandalf planned to persuade a more or less good giant to block the front porch to Goblin Town, showing that all of them weren't savage or evil. In fact, it can be said that the giants weren't particularly aggressive and didn't care much about whatever happened around them, be it war or otherwise. Wereworms. Another type of mythical beast from the Tolkien universe is the wereworm. They were thought to be horrifying monsters that inhabited the Last Desert, which was located far east of the Shire. These creatures have only been mentioned by Bilbo, and, in fact, it's not even known if they were real creatures who actually existed at a point in time, or if they're just a part of Hobbit folklore. For a Hobbit to say that they were ready to fight a wereworm signified that they were ready to face anything. So clearly, these creatures were part and parcel of Hobbit legend. Wereworms have been fleshed out in later adaptations of Tolkien's work, however. Monsters called wereworms appeared in the Hobbit video game from 2003. These intimidatingly enormous worms make their homes in tunnels. They're first noticed following the Trollhole boss battle. When Bilbo kills one of them, which resembles a caterpillar, another one advances to take its place. They can be sneaked up on as they're blind. They have a terrifying snarling sound that resembles a dog. The wereworms briefly appear before and during the Battle of the Five Armies in The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies. As Azog and Ragash assess the route that their forces will go, tunnels built by the monsters first appear. Several wereworms arrive out of nowhere among the hills around Erebor after Thorin and Thranduil hear a rumbling sound beneath the battlefield, but quickly vanish. Gandalf fearfully identifies the creatures as they emerge and calls them wereworms. With maws so strong they could eat through stone and earth like butter, wereworms appeared to be enormous worms. They'd undoubtedly rank among Middle-earth's most formidable and terrible creatures, but because they rarely venture outside of their tunnels into the underworld, their contact with other species is quite infrequent. Mumakil. The Mumakils of the Tolkien universe are better known as Oliphants and are Tolkien's version of mammoth elephants. Mumakils are virtually enormous, extremely intelligent elephants with 2 sets of tusks that can reach an incredible height of 90 feet, with their size comparable to that of a big house. The Haradrim, a particular race of men who are members of Sauron's evil army, are virtually the only ones that could utilize them in combat. With a single swipe of their long, strong tusks, which are frequently covered in spikes or barbed wire, the Oliphants are easily able to obliterate an entire troop of horsemen. They're genuinely frightening creatures, and you can hardly hurt them due to the strength of their skin. In fact, their skin is strong enough to withstand hostile high-velocity arrows. They could also readily puncture any hard item or kill an armored soldier with their razor-sharp tusks. The Mumakil were clever creatures that the kings could prepare for combat, much like regular soldiers. They had no need to worry about getting hurt or dying on the battlefield, as they could obey all of their master's orders. Soldiers would mount gigantic war tower structures on their backs due to their large, broad bodies. In the towers, a number of warriors might be positioned to attack the targets in the sky. They would get on their knees to be able to hoist the battle towers on their backs, which included placing the entire tower on them as well as the necessary armor. Throughout the era of the War of the Rings, these creatures participated in a number of wars led by Sauron. The Red Book claims that they were the forerunners of modern elephants. In times of war, both troops who fought on foot and soldiers who rode horses would be crushed by the savage Mumakils. These monsters of war destroyed everything in their paths and killed anyone who got in their way. No Mumakil could be approached by chariot or horse riders, much less be harmed up close. Their long, pointed, blood-stained teeth revealed their nature of bloodlust and were enough to terrify men on the battlefields. Furthermore, a Mumakil's height advantage could not be overcome by any gear or equipment at the time. In general, the opposing army shuddered in terror anytime these monsters entered a battlefield, and many troops fled. The deadliest and most intense soldiers of the Third Age, the Mumakils, can be considered to have given Sauron a major advantage in his wars. The Mumakils' eyes were their one weak spot. They would lose control due to excruciating agony if the enemy managed to shoot arrows or spears into their eyes. In such a situation, they would rampage against anyone who stood in their way, whether it was their own masters, soldiers, or adversaries. However, it was difficult to directly damage their eyes from a distance because the soldiers had shields and guards put on them. These war machines were used to Sauron's greatest advantage, and as a result, he was able to win many conflicts. Azog the Defiler. The pale, scarred orc chieftain who hunted down Thorin, Bilbo and the dwarves in The Hobbit was Azog the Defiler. He can be identified by the scratch marks on his face and body, as well as by the metal spike that has replaced one of his arms. Azog was the leader of the orcs in Moria, and reportedly the most significant orc in the Northern Realms, yet nothing is known about his early life. Although it's unknown how long an orc lives on average, it's possible that he was one of the ones that Sauron sent to Moria in or around TA 2480. Bolg, his only son that we're aware of, succeeded him after he passed away. Azog made his historical debut in the Third Age. King Thror's ambition to revisit and maybe rediscover Khazad-dûm, whose magnificent ruins Azog lived in, led to its discovery in 2790. He tried to enter the Great Gates, but Azog and his orcs caught him, killed him, and inscribed Azog on his hewn head. When Thror's successor Thrain learned of this, he was furious and gathered a group of dwarves to exact revenge on Azog. The dwarves hunted Azog and numerous battles were fought underground, and so the War of the Dwarves and Orcs got underway. The decisive Battle of Azanulbizar, which took place in front of Moria's gates, took place after 9 years of conflict. The conflict also involved King Thrain II and his son Thorin, and as it was coming to a close, Azog and his guards entered from the inner gate. Nine was worn out and furious to the point of being partially blind. He made a strong effort to swing, but Azog dodged his path and Nine missed. When he avoided the dwarf's blow, the orc kicked him in the leg, causing him to stumble. At that time, Azog tried to thrust and behead him, but was only able to break Nine's neck due to the sturdy chainmail he was wearing. Azog then turned back inside after noticing his soldiers fleeing. However, refusing to let the orc captain escape, Dain II pursued him up the stairs, beheaded him, and impaled his head on a spike. Despite being significantly diminished during the war, Azog's underground dominions in the north passed to his son Bolg, who ruled them for nearly 150 years before he too was killed in the Battle of the Five Armies in TA 2941. Ologhai. Trolls are a common sight when it comes to Middle-earth, but did you know that there is more than one kind of troll? The Ologhai are an advanced breed of troll who were under Sauron's servitude in the final days of the War of the Ring. Appearance-wise, they were quite tall, taller than the regular human, and were also covered with spiky scales. They were also muscular and more intelligent in comparison to your regular everyday troll, along with being far more destructive in nature. They also didn't share the weaknesses that the typical trolls possessed, and were able to move about in direct sunlight. Because of their largely invulnerable and stoic nature, they were thought to be far more similar to orcs. In fact, they were mainly a warring species and often carried war hammers, spiked maces or bucklers. Some of them also had sharp claws, while others possessed tusks. They also hardly ever spoke, and they never used any other language other than the Black Tongue of Mordor. This interesting race isn't mentioned explicitly in The Lord of the Rings. The Ologhai only appears in the appendices, and their origins are shrouded in mystery. It's thought that Sauron bred them, as he did very many evil creatures, for the purposes of battle. He created and shaped them to be less weak in comparison to their earlier versions, hence the Ologhai's invulnerability to sunlight. They primarily inhabited the lands of Mordor and southern Mirkwood, and are also mentioned as having taken part in the Battle of the Black Gate. The Ologhai were portrayed in the movie The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King as big trolls that wore dark armor and carried the warhammers that were mentioned in the appendices. They served mostly as shock troops during the siege of Gondor after the gates of Minas Tirith were breached, though later an Ologhai engages Aragorn in combat at the Black Gate and nearly kills him. They're distinct from the other trolls seen in the movies in that they have hair on their bodies and more forward-facing eyes. They're often black, dark green, grey or reddish brown in hue. They stand at an average of 10 to 15 feet tall and have 24 fangs, as opposed to the typical 8 to 10 feet tall trolls. Ents. A mysterious species from Tolkien's literature is the Ent. In the Two Towers, Merry and Pippin ran into Treebeard, the leader of the great race. The Ents are the protectors of the forest, and though Treebeard repeatedly insists that he was an Ent and not a tree, the Ents are best described as moving trees. While they're sleeping, you really can't tell the difference between them and regular trees. Ents have an extremely long lifespan and are able to move, talk, think, and fight. Until someone threatens the forest, they avoid conflict. At that point, things become serious. When Treebeard and the Ent Council realized what Saruman was doing to the nearby woods, they flooded Isengard, utterly destroying it and trapping the wizard inside his tower. The early history of the Ents is largely unknown, but it's known that they once protected and lived in the vast forests of Middle-earth. They also made a brief appearance in stories near the end of the First Age, where they were apparently attacking a group of dwarves at the Battle of Sarn Athrad, after being supposedly summoned by Beren and Luthien. The vast forests that once covered all of Eriador and were under Treebeard's control were either felled by the Númenóreans of the Second Age or completely destroyed during the disastrous War of the Elves and Sauron in the 17th century of the Second Age. Merry and Pippin witnessed Treebeard bragging about the power of the Ents. They were, according to him, much more powerful than trolls that Morgoth in the Elder Days or First Age created as a parody of the Ents, but were nowhere near as powerful as them. He draws an analogy with orcs, who were Morgoth's attempt to imitate the elves. Ents are also known to have sluggish speech and a large vocabulary. In truth, the Entish language seems to have its roots in a prehistoric version of Common Eldarin that was later supplemented by Quenya and Sindarin, but it still has many distinctive tree-ish words. Interestingly, Tolkien's Ents, which look like humanoid trees, are considerably dissimilar from conventional Ents. They appear to have been inspired from the talking trees that figure in numerous folktales around the world. Trolls. Trolls were also first conceived by the forces of evil created by Sauron before the First Age. However, they didn't exactly turn out the way Sauron had imagined. While they're huge in size, with the largest members of the species growing up to a height of 50 feet, they're not particularly clever and are only good when brute strength is needed. Trolls do, however, have one fatal flaw. When they're exposed to sunlight, they turn to stone. Due to this unique weakness, trolls are usually exclusively used by Sauron at night as punchers, door breakers, or equipment carriers. The greatest remaining servant of Melkor, Sauron, recruited some of the trolls who had survived the War of Wrath into his army. Trolls were among Sauron's most lethal fighters in the Second and Third Ages. He then developed the Ologhai, who were more intelligent than prior troll breeds because the original ones weren't quite up to the mark. Some were said to be able to communicate, while others appeared to be animal-like in their reasoning. They were practically resistant to physical attacks due to their stone-thick hide. They seem to enjoy eating meat and will consume practically any creature they come across. They behave in a revolting manner as well. There are several different varieties of trolls, each unique to their habitats, with origins in Norse mythology, a very popular concept at the time. These include stone trolls, hill trolls, cave trolls, mountain trolls, and snow trolls, as well as the more recent Ologhai and half trolls. Notably, Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, used a group of trolls as his bodyguards during the Battle of Beleriand. The great warrior Húrin faced them as he led his troops in a last stand to defend Torgon's escape and the continued secrecy of the Kingdom of Gondolin. Thanks to Morgoth's strong orders to have Húrin captured alive, he was able to slay many of them. The near-Ninth Arnoediad, in which Morgoth defeated the combined forces of elves, men and dwarves, came to a close with Húrin's capture as the slain troll's allegedly corrosive blood melted his axe and allowed orcs to swarm over him and bind him. So, while they're definitely not the smartest of creatures, they're definitely not to be messed with. Ogres. Ogres were terrifying, destructive creatures from Middle-earth tradition and folklore. However, it's unknown if they ever existed. The histories of the Elder Days never mention any ogres, and none are known to have participated in the wars and battles. They actually might have been a totally fictitious race. Ogres, together with Gongs and the other Vanimor, were the names given by J.R.R. Tolkien to one of the monsters produced by Melkor in the Legendarium's early writings. They're described as enormous cannibals. There are some things that we do know from on-screen portrayals of the ogres. Ogres are roughly on par with trolls in terms of power, but for a few reasons are better than them in terms of being a fighting species. They are, or at least they appear to be, a little smarter than trolls. They're also strong fighters. Third, they don't have the vulnerability to sunshine. Therefore, they won't turn into stone throughout the day. Ogres, however, are significantly smaller than their troll cousins. Don't get me wrong, they're larger and more difficult to kill than orcs. They simply don't reach 50 feet in height. Ogres have appeared in the Hobbit trilogy. They were more frequently employed by Azog and Bolg than trolls because they were quicker and didn't mind getting suntanned. Interestingly, Tolkien uses the term ogre to describe Morgoth, whose shrunken size in his dying days was apparently ogre size. They're mentioned in several poems which are based solely on legend, and they, as we've mentioned before, may not have ever existed. Other primitive texts that are less canonical than The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, such as the Book of Lost Tales, also make reference to them. According to those tales, Llywelyn or Ulbandi, an ogre, was Morgoth's former mistress. Mythical or not, if you ever come face to face with one, running is your only option, because they're fabled for their strength and complete lack of compassion. Carcharoth. Werewolves Carcharoth and Draugluin are fearsome creatures in Tolkien's world. However, they don't exactly resemble the stereotype of werewolves which howl at the moon and turn into other creatures during a full moon. The first werewolf, Draugluin, was a wolf that the Dark Lord combined with an evil spirit. Draugluin was still strong, but Carcharoth, the second werewolf, represented a new development in Morgoth's creation. He was a direct descendant of Draugluin and had been fed on living flesh that had been magically augmented. He was constantly provoked during his formative years for the purpose of making him as vicious and aggressive as possible. Due to his diet of elvish and mannish flesh, Carcharoth gained a great amount of weight and developed an insatiable need for flesh and blood. The enormous werewolf was a very terrifying creature, with blazing eyes, poisonous jaws and claws. Carcharoth, also known as Anfauglier, the Jaws of Thirst, became enormous in size and his power looked unmatched. His teeth were as poisonous as the spears of Morgoth's orc army, and his eyes burned like red embers. Nobody could enter through the gate of Angband without the approval of Carcharoth, who served as its guardian. The walls of Angband were sheer, and on each side of the road were terrifying chasms filled with serpents. Carcharoth was always awake and standing in front of the gate. Morgoth made the decision to create a werewolf to kill Huan, because he knew that Huan could only be killed by the strongest wolf that had ever existed after hearing of the fall of Tolin Gawroth, where Huan had beaten Drauglin and Sauron. When Beren and Luthien had to pass him on their way into Angband, Carcharoth got embroiled in the quest for the Silmaril. He halted them because he was skeptical of Draugluin, who was actually Beren in disguise. This was because he knew of Draugluin's passing and was thus suspicious when he saw a being that looked to be Draugluin pass him. On their way out, Carcharoth attacked before Luthien could use her charms to enchant him once more. In an effort to fend off the beast, Beren held out the captured Silmaril, but Carcharoth bit off Beren's hand at the wrist, taking the Silmaril with it. Carcharoth's internal organs were destroyed by the Silmaril, and the pain drove him insane. He travelled across Beleriand before reaching Doriath in the south. There, Huan the Hound joined forces with Beren Erchamion, Elu Thingol, Beleg Cuthalion, and Mablung to pursue him. In FA 466, Beren and Huan killed Carcharoth, but they both perished in the process.
Who would be so bold as to come armed into my kingdom?
Goblins. Many Lord of the Rings enthusiasts mistakenly believe that goblins and orcs are interchangeable terms. That isn't truly the case though. Despite being connected to orcs as they were both designed for malicious reasons, the two species are essentially distinct, especially because Peter Jackson portrayed them as different species in the films, and also because the term orc appears in Tolkien's later writings, while goblin is extensively used in The Hobbit. Both goblins and orcs have numerous subspecies among them. Goblins typically have smaller, more elongated bodies with pointed extremities. You could say that goblins are more like elves and that orcs are more like humans. While goblins are often relatively small, the Goblin King was a massive creature. However, because of his fat, inert form, he wasn't all that powerful. After the War of Wrath in the First Age, the goblins have resided in many fortresses located deep beneath the Misty Mountains. In a note at the beginning of The Hobbit, Tolkien explained that he was using English to represent the languages spoken by the characters, and that goblin was the English translation he was using for the word orc, which he wrote is the hobbits' form of their name for them. Tolkien defined them as big, ugly creatures, cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. In The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien frequently used the word goblin, for example when he originally described the Uruk-hai of Isengard as 4 goblin soldiers of greater stature. Goblins are also more intelligent than regular orcs and have a passion for engineering, science, creating weapons, etc. Despite being portrayed as a fairly primitive and tribal race, goblins appear to have more sophisticated technology than other Middle-earth races. Tolkien claims that goblins have dark technology in The Hobbit. In the chapter Over Hill and Under Hill, Tolkien writes, "It's not unlikely that they invented some of the things that have disturbed the world, especially the cunning devices for killing vast numbers of people at once, for wheels, engines and explosives always pleased them." Shadowfax. Shadowfax was a member of the long-lived Mearas race, the finest horses in all of Middle-earth, and a descendant of Felaroth. It was stated that Shadowfax ran quicker than the wind and was able to understand human speech. Shadowfax was too untamed to be domesticated by the Rohirrim and was originally owned by Theoden, King of Rohan. Finally, Theoden delivered him to Gandalf the White. In the daytime, Shadowfax's coat is described as a silvery grey and is barely discernible at night. Following his escape from Orthanc, Gandalf the Grey first rode Shadowfax during the events leading up to the Council of Elrond. Much to the displeasure of the king, Gandalf chose Shadowfax when he was instructed to take any horse and leave by a dubious Theoden. Gandalf tamed him and then utilized the huge steed's speed to travel the immense wilderness between Rohan and the Shire in just 6 days. Just before reaching Rivendell, he let the horse go, sending Shadowfax back to Rohan. He was then seen when Gandalf, who became known as Gandalf the White, called him in need of horses so that he, Gimli, Aragorn and Legolas might pass through Rohan. Due to his superior strength and the endurance compared to the weaker steeds and the urgency of their travel, Shadowfax carried them on his back. Shadowfax was Gandalf's permanent mount from that point on, especially after Theoden gave him to Gandalf formally, earning the wizard the nickname the White Rider. When Gandalf collected the dispersed Rohirrim army under Erkenbrand and led the attack that defeated Saruman's army during the Battle of the Hornburg, he frequently employed Shadowfax's exceptional speed to his advantage. A finer horse will never appear on Middle-earth again, according to Theoden. When Sauron thought Peregrine held the ring after seeing him in Saruman's Palantir, he was crucial in getting Gandalf and Peregrine took from Rohan to Minas Tirith. Along with being there at the final battle before the Black Gate, Shadowfax played a crucial role during the siege of Gondor. Later, he transported Gandalf back to the north by himself. Shadowfax is thought to have travelled with Gandalf across the sea and into the west. Uruk-hai. The apex predators of the orc species are the Uruk-hai. The Uruk-hai are significantly bigger, stronger and smarter than ordinary orcs, who were essentially rather dumb and used as disposable items. Additionally, they're better soldiers, able to plot and strategize rather than simply marching forward or cutting wood in Isengard. Ugluk was the terrifying beast who served as their commander. The Uruk-hai squad that ambushed the Fellowship of the Ring and kidnapped Merry and Pippin was led by him. He didn't, however, fill Boromir with arrows. That was Lurtz, the sturdiest Uruk-hai warrior, who subsequently suffered a fatal head wound from impaling himself on Aragorn's sword. The Uruks, sometimes known as Black Orcs of Immense Might, initially emerged from Mordor in the final years of Denethor I's stewardship. They took control of Ithilien and destroyed the city of Osgiliath in 2475, but Steward Boromir eventually overcame them. In the years that followed, the Orcs of Mordor and Uruks continued to infest the city. Also glimpsed among the Misty Mountains orcs were some Uruks who were covertly working for Saruman. Treebeard questions if they're orcs who have been improved or are corrupted men who have acquired orc-like traits, or if they are actually created through the merging of men and orcs, an act he deemed to be a black evil. The Red Eye of Sauron was an emblem used by the Uruks who worked for Barad-dûr, the dwellers of Mordor. The Red Eye was also painted on their shields. On the front of their iron helms, the Uruk-hai of Saruman the White bore an an S-shaped elf rune made in white metal. It was obvious that this S represented Saruman. Their equipment, Aragorn remarked, was nothing like that of other orcs. They favoured short, broad-bladed swords over curved scimitars. They used large yew wood bows that were identical in length and shape to those used by men. Even though they disliked sunlight, they could tolerate it better than other orcs. They were offered man-flesh as a treat by Saruman. Saruman seems to be the sole creator of the Uruks in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. The bonus commentary on the DVD edition said that they were attempting to model the scene on an early statement of Tolkien's that orcs worm their way out of the ground like maggots. They're depicted in the film as being freed from a kind of membrane in the mud deep beneath Isengard. Wargs. Orcs and goblins frequently ride frightening creatures called wargs. They resemble enormous wolves, and it's possible to tell them apart from other species due to their size and the shape of their heads. Unlike their wolven ancestors, wargs can be saddled like horses as they're highly intelligent. The species is extremely strong, hefty and muscular, and it has sharp fangs and a brain that enables it to launch attacks on demand, in addition to simply hunting for food. It was also believed that the wargs were a demonic kind of wolf and were possessed by evil spirits. The breed's origin is unknown. Perhaps it was one of the animals that Morgoth created in the old days. In any case, in the later Third Age, Gandalf included the wargs among the list of creatures that were Sauron's slaves. The wargs were observed in Rhovanion, where they frequently formed alliances with the Misty Mountains orcs and served as mounts. The dreadful language of the wargs was spoken by these ferocious and cunning beasts. They assaulted the company in Moria in the Fellowship of the Ring, and they also attacked the caravan retreating from Edoras to Helm's Deep in the Two Towers. They further made a fleeting appearance in the Return of the Kings, the Siege of Minas Tirith, most notably at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, gave us our last opportunity to witness wargs in action when Azog and his orc army used them to drive Gandalf, Thorin and the dwarves to the edge of a cliff and up the trees. So, whatever you do, and despite how fluffy they might look, do not go near them. Barrow White. The Barrow Whites were nocturnal shapeshifters that lived in the shadows of Eriador, including the Barrow Downs, and shared traits with wraiths. Whites emerged as shadowy phantoms with glowing icy eyes and a horrifying, bewitching voice. Their skeletal hands had an icy feel and a terrible grip. The Barrow Whites lured the living into the Downs tombs by casting spells on their victims, causing them to lose their free will. Some, if not all, of the victims were placed on a stone altar and shackled with gold chains before being dressed in white fabric and ancient jewels, and then being slaughtered by a wight brandishing a sacrificial sword. They were formidable spirits that could only be repelled in the darkness by powerful incantations like Tom Bombadil's song. Because they had relied for so long on the darkness and safety of burial vaults, they were afraid of the sun and would suffer from exposure to it. The Barrow Whites were technically evil spirits, although it's uncertain what kind of spirits they really were, whether they were twisted Maiar, orc, fallen Avari, or malevolent men spirits. After the Dunedain of Cardolan perished at the hands of the Great Plague, the Barrow Whites started to appear in the Barrow Downs. The Barrow Downs, the oldest men's burial ground in Middle-earth, were located east of the Brandywine River and beyond the Old Forest. There were dome-shaped hills covered in grass and turf, topped with monoliths and enormous rings of white stone, yet there were neither trees nor water to be found there. These hills served as the Edain's burial mounds during the First Age of the Sun and the Kings of Men during the Second and Third Ages. The Witch King of Angmar, who wanted to prevent the Dunedain from resettling in the area, dispatched these wicked spirits to do his dirty work. Notably, Frodo Baggins, Sam Gamgee, Merry and Pippin were imprisoned in what was thought to be the burial cairn of the last Prince of Cardolan by Whites on September 28, 3018, while travelling through the Barrow Downs. A White there came close to killing them. Black Númenóreans. The Black Númenóreans were a fallen race of Númenóreans descended from those who were devoted to the Númenórean scepter, but opposed to the Valar and their ties to the elves. They were originally known as the King's Men. These Númenóreans listened to Sauron's speeches once he was brought to Númenor as a captive in fair form, and he swiftly corrupted them. They subjugated the remaining men in Middle-earth and worshipped the darkness and its masters, Melkor first and later Sauron. Since then, they have been the enemy's agents and fierce rivals of the men of Gondor. Their origin story is as follows. Over the course of the Second Age, the Númenóreans' strength and knowledge increased, and they began to wonder why life, which had previously limited their happiness and eventually their might, ever existed. They began to fear the gift of men and made an effort to put it off or bring life back. The majority of the Númenóreans, who had begun to resemble the immortal Eldar in appearance, were jealous of them due to their growing desire to avoid death. The one god Ilúvatar gave all men the gift of death, and Ilúvatar's will could not be overruled, which is what the Eldar attempted to constantly remind the men of Númenor. However, the Númenóreans split after Tar-Ankalimon was crowned King of Númenor in SA 2221. The king's men abandoned the Valar and the Eldar, eventually subjecting themselves to Sauron's corruption. 3 of the ring wraiths were strong Númenórean lords who had fallen under Sauron's influence. They were enslaved to Sauron's will and served him for 1,000 years before the fall. Their desire for knowledge or power caused them to become his slaves. The Black Númenóreans were thus the name given to the king's men once they gave in to Sauron's wickedness. Many Black Númenóreans continued to serve Sauron when he left Númenor and returned to Middle-earth after its destruction. Herimor and Fuinor were 2 Black Númenóreans who gained influence among the Haradrim in the regions south of Mordor. In order to fight the elves and exiles, Sauron assembled a large number of his servants from the south. Among them were numerous Black Númenóreans. The last alliance's victory signaled the Black Númenórean race's demise. They rapidly disappeared or assimilated into the men of Middle-earth. Despite the decline of their race, their descendants kept control of Umbar and carried on their animosity towards Gondor. Bolg the Orc. The son of the Orc war chief Azog, Bolg was the Misty Mountains Orc chieftain in the latter Third Age. Despite Azog's likely physical superiority, Bolg outperformed his father in a number of areas, including one-on-one battles, tactics, and army leadership. Bolg is a ruthless, cynical, harsh, and bloodthirsty fighter. He has no qualms about slaughtering the men of the lake town, and even seemed to enjoy Kili's demise, demonstrating his profound sadism. He is also psychotic and heartless, as evidenced by the callousness with which he plans the attack on Lake Town. However, he's incredibly smart and a great strategist. Bolg is pragmatic and strong, with a tremendous amount of willpower and exceptional tactical acumen. He proves to be as ruthless and ferocious as his military father, and just as obstinate. Despite this, they have a close bond, as Bolg is fiercely loyal to his father and wants to make him proud. Being a skilled leader, Bolg was Azog's deputy in charge of the Gundabad Orc Pack while his father was still alive and in command. His fighting style emphasizes quickness and agility, martial arts maneuvers, and leveraging the natural surroundings against his adversary. Later, his leadership of the Orc Packs while Azog stays to battle Gandalf also demonstrates his fighting prowess. When Legolas stabs Bolg in the hand near the end of their struggle, Bolg doesn't show any signs of discomfort or even bleed, demonstrating an extremely high pain tolerance. Further, while warg riding isn't his favorite method of combat, he is still very proficient at it. In The Hobbit, Bolg replaced Azog as war chief when the latter was killed in the Battle of Azanulbizar, the final conflict of the War of the Dwarves and the Orcs in TA 2799, by Dain II Ironfoot. Bolg then relocated to Mount Gundabad, the former haven of the Orcs. He would go on to establish control over the goblins of the Misty Mountains there. After around 150 years, he participated in the Battle of the Five Armies as the leader of a goblin, warg and bat army along with his bodyguards. He was defeated in that battle by the powerful Beorn, who did it to exact revenge on behalf of Thorin II Oakenshield, who had suffered a deadly wound. Candles of Corpses, also known as Dead Faces. The Dead Faces, also known as Candles of Corpses, appeared in the Mere of Dead Faces in the Dead Marshes as the ghostly faces of fallen Elven, Mannish, and Orcish fighters. The faces appeared in the dark waters lit by faint and flickering lights, like from hidden candles, with weed caught in their hair. These apparitions had faces that were twisted and decaying, making them a horrifying sight. It's unknown how the dead warriors were changed into such undead creatures, but Frodo theorized about devilry birthed in the Dark Land, probably alluding to Sauron's wicked practices in nearby Mordor. A luminous apparition resembling the flame of a candle, occasionally observed in churchyards and other wet locations, superstitiously considered as portending death, is what is referred to as a corpse candle. Tolkien coined the Quenya expression Vi Kevo Kalma, which translates to like a corpse candle for a piece of poetry. Crebine. The crebine is a species of black-feathered birds that live in the wilds of Dunland and were once found in Fangorn Forest. The wild men who pillage Rohan originate in Dunland, which means black land. This area is named for the residents' black hair and dark looks. In fact, the crebine are among the few animals that still live in the cursed woodland. The Sindarin Elvish word Kraban, which means crow, is where the name Crebine is derived from. When Saruman used to stroll around the forests surrounding Isengard, it's said that he used to have peaceful conversations with these creatures. Thus, the creatures have been working together with Saruman for a very long time. When Saruman submits to Sauron's influence and swears loyalty to him, he is able to persuade the Crebine to serve as his spies in the hunt for the halflings he believes to be in possession of the One Ring. Although there are many distinct hobbits and he is unaware that it's Frodo in particular who bears the weight, the Crebine accomplish their work effectively. He then tells the orcs and crows to keep an eye out for the hobbits, which leads to Merry and Pippin being taken prisoner by the Uruk-hai. In Peter Jackson's 2001 film version of the book, the Crebine of Dunland first appears while the Fellowship practices sword combat before entering the mines of Moria. While Bill the pony keeps watch for any potential threats, Merry and Pippin engage in combat with Boromir, who is teaching them self-defense. Meanwhile, the other members of the Fellowship ponder their future. During this time, Legolas notices an approaching dark mass that appears to be a huge cloud, traveling quickly against the breeze. The Fellowship manages to hide in time after Legolas recognizes the creatures as Saruman's spies. The Crebine are then seen flying back to Saruman to report their findings. It's interesting to note that the entire minute-long scene in which they fly through Isengard's forge and witness the orcs forging weapons for their troops and trees bursting into flames was shot in miniature. Saruman is informed of the Fellowship's location and potential routes after the Crebine fly through the forge and arrive at Saruman's location. It's unclear how they communicate with him because it isn't implied that they share a common language or have any other language capabilities beside bird squawking. The Order of Wizards, however, is renowned for its ability to communicate with a wide variety of species throughout Middle-earth. It's because of the intel given to him by the bird-like creatures that Saruman is able to make the mountain path so difficult that they're unable to traverse it. You could also argue that Gandalf's death, the dissolution of the Fellowship, and Frodo and Sam travelling separately into Mordor are all eventually caused by the Crebines of Dunland. Kurumo, or Saruman. Saruman, the Wizard of Isengard, was an Istari. In the Third Age of the Sun, Saruman the White, the leader of the Istari, the Order of Wizards, arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000. He was called Kurumo in the Undying Lands, a Maya spirit of Owl the Smith. When he first arrived, he wore white robes, had raven hair, and talked with a voice that was both wise and fair. He travelled throughout Middle-earth in search of the Dark Lord and was given the name Kurunir by the elves, which means man of skill. But with time, he developed a sense of self-importance and yearned for authority. Saruman entered Isengard and the Tower of Orthanc in the year 2759 and called forth orcs, half-orcs, Uruk-hai and Dunlandings under a black flag bearing a white handprint. He unintentionally turned into the Ring Lord's servant after becoming caught in his web. However, in the War of the Rings, the Ents' march on Isengard and the Rohirrim's victory at the Battle of Hornburg combined to completely destroy Saruman's dominion. Finally, Gandalf broke his staff and robbed him of his magical abilities. Saruman's defeat brought him to a point where he sought out small-time retribution in the Shire. There, during a pitiful final attempt to rule, Saruman was defeated by the hobbits and killed by his own lowly servant, Grima Wormtongue. Prior to Gandalf, Saruman presided as the head of the White Council and was the chief of the wizards, giving him access to a number of abilities. When he was at the height of his might, he was indeed exceedingly powerful, and he was able to capture Gandalf the Grey. Saruman was characterized by Gandalf as having immense wisdom, guile and skill. He had many covert agents, including spies on two legs and birds, and was able to breed his own Uruk-hai. He had a vast grasp of mechanics and ring lore, which allowed him to build powerful forges and explosives that could scale Helm's Deep's walls and kill an Ent by burning it. He was skilled in magic, and one spell he performed gave the orcs that had taken Merry and Pippin, while impeding Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, insane speed and strength. But speaking was by far Saruman's greatest strength. Simply by speaking to them, he seemed to be able to subdue all but the strongest of minds. Even with Isengard destroyed and Saruman's betrayal exposed, Gandalf still had to exercise extreme caution because Saruman could trap just about anyone with the force of his voice, and few could resist his will. Only Gandalf himself allegedly remained completely unaffected. During this time, according to Aragorn, only Gandalf, Elrond and Galadriel could still withstand his voice. Later, Saruman convinced Treebeard to let him leave Orthanc by using his skill of persuasion. Unfortunately, Saruman's in-depth familiarity with the Rings of Power contributed to his demise, as he developed a lust for their power, especially the One Ring. Draugluin. The first werewolf in the Tolkien universe, Draugluin, was a wolf that the Dark Lord combined with an evil spirit as one of his twisted experiments. The terrifying, ancient and wicked monster Draugluin lived in Tol in Gawroth, the former watchtower of Finrod Felagund, with his master Sauron. He was the father and king of all werewolves in Beleriand. Karkaroth and other numerous werewolves came from Draugluin, their father. Given that these wolves could talk, indicating they had fear or soul, the embodied spirit of an incarnate being, it's likely that they were descended from him, along with the wargs of the Third Age and the White Wolves. It's possible that Draugluin himself was a fallen Maiar. After a lengthy struggle, Huan killed Draugluin during the quest for the Silmaril, and Beren and Luthien used his pelt to smuggle themselves into Angband. His direct descendant, a werewolf named Karkaroth, went on to become the most powerful werewolf that ever lived, and even avenged his father Draugluin's death. Vampires of Middle-earth. The strange vampires of Middle-earth who resembled bats worked for Morgoth and Sauron. The sole vampire whose name appears in the Chronicles of Arda is Sauron's servant Thuringwethil, while Sauron himself at least once assumed the appearance of a vampire to escape Huan. Vampires are depicted as being the former Maiar patrons of regular bats who were corrupted by Morgoth and turned into demons with, quote, the visage of horrible men or women, end quote, and the power to change their appearance. The Blood White, an undead mannish shapeshifter that draws blood from living things, is another comparable monster that has been imagined by Tolkien. There is no evidence that the vampires persisted in Middle-earth past the First Age. In fact, Tolkien may have just picked the term vampire because of its contemporary associations with creatures related to bats. A new creature developed for the Lord of the Rings Online called the Merivale seems to be inspired by Tolkien's vampires. They're terrifying women with bat wings and pointed talons. Merville is the name given to the species' males. Variags. A little-known ethnic group called the Variags lived in Khand. The Variags originated in Khand, a region to the southeast of Mordor. It's unclear if the Variags refer to men of Khand in general, or to a particular tribe or subset of those people. Records in Gondor refer to peoples of Khand, and Variags are known to have lived there. Apart from the fact that they participated in the War of the Ring for Sauron, little is known about the Variags. They first showed up in TA 1944, battling alongside the Wain Riders, an Easterling clan in the northeast of Middle-earth. The Variags also fought in Sauron's army against Gondor at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields on March 14th and 15th, TA 1319. The majority of information regarding the Variags is theoretical because J.R.R. Tolkien never detailed them. In fact, there are no Variags in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings film trilogy either, which is probably due to their limited depiction and description in the books. However, the Slavic term for mercenaries is Variag and comes from the Norse Varingar. Additionally, the Varangian Guard were the Byzantine Emperor's Norse bodyguards. There has thus been speculation that Tolkien used the Slavic term to suggest that the Variags might have been mercenaries working for a potential Lord of Khand. Flies of Mordor. Morgai flies became a staple in the region due to Mordor's propensity for leaving the recently deceased without a grave. Any damage to these nests caused the insects to become enraged, and their nests can be seen hanging anywhere there might be flesh to be had. When this occurs, a swarm of these little evil creatures cooperate with one another to form a relentless stinging mass that is strong enough to overpower even the most highly armoured Uruk. They won't immediately assault Talion or the Uruk army, but if their nest is in jeopardy, they'll become enraged. An excellent illustration of this would be to use Azkar to shoot an arrow at their nest and knock it off its perch. This will result in them leaving their nest and organising into an angry mass of stingers that is enough to scare off all common foes of Uruk. They would also mainly attack nearby Uruks themselves when disturbed. They're particularly prevalent in Gorgoroth, where they were previously known as orc flies. Although they only drank blood, they delighted in devouring almost any kind of animal they could locate. Morgai flies were huge, grey or black in colour, with red eyes, and were related to common horseflies. Many historians thought that they were constructs of the Dark Lord. This may have been the case for some of the larger subgroups, but the basic species were only enormous primitive vermin. The red markings on their backs, in particular, are reminiscent of the burning eye of Sauron, implying that these creatures are manifestations of his evil spirit. Almost all blood-borne infections were conveyed by Morgai flies, which were also a significant factor in the propagation of the Great Plague of TA 1636. According to legend, the might of the Dark Lord was so immense that it permeated through his realm, reaching down to even the tiniest of living things. As Frodo and Sam travelled through Mordor and across the Morgai towards Mount Doom at the end of the Third Age, the flies bothered them on their journey. Gollum. Smeagol, often known as Gollum, was a monster that once was a storish hobbit who carried the One Ring. He spent the majority of his life in the Misty Mountains. He lost his precious ring to Bilbo Baggins in TA 2941. After losing the ring, he spent the rest of his days trying to get his beautiful birthday present back. He followed the Fellowship of the Ring in TA 3019, where he ran into Frodo Baggins. He finally got his hands on the ring in Samath Naur after taking Frodo into Mordor and betraying him to the giant spider Shelob. He then fell into the Mount Doom fires in his euphoria, destroyed the ring and perished. Smeagol was a hobbit, but the ring made him spend many years imprisoned in dampness and darkness under the spell of its evil influence. He might not have turned into a wraith because of his tough, hobbit-like mentality. He was, however, reduced to a small, emaciated, wiry man with a skinny neck, pale complexion, flat feet, long, thin hands, clammy fingers and wide, glowing, pale eyes. Because of the time he spent underground, he had excellent senses of hearing, smell and sight. Despite having just 6 teeth left, his bite had immense power, even being able to sever Frodo's finger. He could also move and climb stealthily like a spider. Smeagol was the most inquisitive and inquiring member of his community. He was swift and powerful. He was drawn to origins and the beginning. He dove, burrowed and tunneled under trees, plants and mounds. He owed his moniker to his fascination with roots and deep pools. He tended to avoid anything on higher ground such as flowers, trees and views of the hills. He developed a multiple personality during his centuries of isolation and under the ring's influence. His evil personality was a slave to the ring and would kill for it, overwhelming his previous self, who still vaguely recalled concepts like friendship and love. He regularly argued with himself as he had no one else to talk to. The ring and himself were both adored and hated by Gollum. He frequently referred to both himself and the ring as "my precious," possibly conflating the two objects. Years later, Samwise Gamgee would designate the bad personality as Stinker and the good personality as Slinker. The hatred of all living things, especially elves and all things elven, was another feature of the ring's corruption. Lembas tasted like dust to him and choked him, while the elven rope burned his skin. As a hobbit, Smeagol may have had a kind heart, but he was also rather greedy and cruel, which led to him becoming deeply corrupted by the ring. As opposed to Gollum, who started his adventures with the ring with murder, Bilbo started his with an act of mercy, which is why the ring took a much longer time to corrupt him. Hobgoblin. Hobgoblin was the Third Age term for the greater sorts of orcs that were present in Middle-earth. The Grey Mountains are absolutely thick with goblins, hobgoblins and orcs of the worst sort, is what Gandalf informed Bilbo Baggins in his quest for Erebor. Hobgoblins were hence more powerful, intimidating and massive than ordinary orcs. They're only referred to once in The Hobbit by Gandalf. They were one of the several varieties of orcs that lived in the Wilderland, according to Gandalf. They most likely belong to the Uruk-hai race or another especially huge breed of orcs that inhabits the Wilderland. However, the term hobgoblins is used in The Hobbit to refer to all larger species of orcs rather than a distinct orc race. In contrast to the goblins, or orcs of The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien claimed in a letter from 1971 that hobgoblins were actually smaller versions of traditional goblins, as far as folklore was concerned. However, in the Tolkien variety, the term hobgoblin is used to refer to a much larger species. Gorkrows. A mythological breed of bird, gorkrows are only briefly mentioned in the poetry of the Hobbits. According to legend, these vile crows who croaked while sleeping coexisted with the dreaded mewlips in the same moist marshes. According to some adaptations, gorkrows have a 4-foot wingspan, they're the crebine's smaller cousins, and are drawn to shiny objects. A larger variation of the common gorkrow is said to reside in Forodwaith, and is known as the northern gorkrow. According to legend, the Lossoth view northern gorkrows as foreboding birds. Gorkrows, a kind of crebine indigenous to the Lone Lands, are depicted in the 2007 Lord of the Rings Online. They're plentiful in Mordor as well. Dumbledore. In the adventures of Tom Bombadil, the Errantry, a mythological ferocious race of winged insects known as Dumbledores, is referenced in the Tolkien universe. It's thought that men have forgotten about the beginnings and the past of these creatures. A knight on a mission was supposed to have faced off against the Dumbledores on Lost, according to legend. How the small insects managed this feat is, however, unknown. It's interesting to note that the Old English words Dumbledore and Dumbledore, with an E at the end, were used to refer to bumblebees. It's likely that the names of these creatures come from there. The Midgewater marshes are home to these gigantic winged insects known as Dumbledores. They're said to weigh 6 to 8 pounds and spread disease or poison. They're further described as being unpleasant insects that inhabit bogs and marshes near the Shire. They're also thought to be close friends with the moths and resemble Nicabreakers, another creature from Hobbit lore. Notably, water annoys the Dumbledores, so if you think you might run into them, carry water to ward them off while you make your escape. Dunlandings, animalistic men. Men who dwelt in Dunland's plains were known as Dunlandings, also known as the Wild Men of Dunland. They had a reputation of being a ferocious race and vowed retribution against the Rohirrims, who had pushed them into the mountains. The wizard Saruman utilized their rage during the War of the Ring to control and persuade them to plunder Rohan. These tribal hillmen lived in the Second Age territories west and south of the Misty Mountains, all the way down to the lowlands around the White Mountains before the Númenóreans arrived in Middle-earth. They were wary of the individuals who arrived from the west and grew to fear and despise them. By the beginning of the Third Age, they had become less common due to the amount of hunting and persecution they'd endured. They had gathered in the White Mountain valleys and the grassy plains of Dunland, which were located west of the Misty Mountains between Moria and Isengard at the time. A small number had travelled farther north and became the forefathers of the Men of Bree. These folks, who became known as Dunlandings, subsequently settled primarily in Dunland. The Dunlanding hill people, who were accustomed to living in severe surroundings, were frequently seen wearing fur and leather clothing. They might have been related to the northern snowmen of Foreshell. They were strong, robust, large, and had long, unkempt beards and hair. Due to their location in the hilly and forested region of Dunland, the Dunlandings most likely relied on hunting, fishing, and foraging for food, with agriculture serving as a secondary source of sustenance. At the fords of Isen, they were allegedly using cavalry at the time. It's unclear what weapons they often use. The men of Dunland are represented as a tribe of evil people in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, as they agree to serve Sauron by helping him destroy the kingdoms of men. They form an alliance with the Isengard orcs and begin raiding Rohan's settlements. The Dunlanding chieftain is seen swearing a blood oath to Saruman in the Wizard's Tower of Orthanc in the extended version of The Two Towers. Gothmog. The Return of the King and its movie version features Gothmog as a minor enemy. He is an orc commander who serves Sauron and commands the army of Mordor in the Battle of Pelennor Fields against Minas Tirith, with the Witch King of Angmar, Sauron's closest ally. Although the race of Gothmog is unknown in the books, he is represented as an orc in the movies. Lawrence McAwari played the part, and Craig Parker provided the voice for Gothmog. Gothmog served as the Witch King of Angmar's second-in-command during the Battle of the Pelennor fields in the Third Age from Minas Morgul. When Éowyn and Merry killed the Witch King in that battle, he took command of all 7,000 or so orcs there. Although Gothmog's race is unexplained in the books, it's widely accepted that he is an orc or someone very closely related. In The Lord of the Rings, he is only referenced once at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields when his master is slain. He summoned his army's reserve out of Osgiliath and into the main conflict in relation to the Rohirrim's entrance, as well as Easterlings, Southrons, Variags and Trollmen, whom he led into the clash. Gothmog, like other Mordor orcs, hated the race of men and desired their annihilation so that orcs could reign supreme. He is cruel, intending to exterminate Minas Tirith's entire populace, and wanted to assassinate Madril while Madril was vulnerable. He is also sadistic, cackling callously as Minas Tirith is destroyed, and sending the heads of slain Gondor soldiers rolling onto the city. Even his own soldiers are subject to his harsh treatment. He forbids them from dodging hurled debris and shoves one aside when the man tries to assist him. He also demonstrated his skill as a fighter by successfully battling Éowyn before being injured by her. He has leadership experience and is adept at strategizing and employing tactics, as evidenced by the fact that he knew of and ordered Grond to smash the Minas Tirith gate, and that he successfully captured Osgiliath by using the water. He also instructed the orcs to deploy their pikes on the front lines and their archers in the back, and he intimidated and terrorized his adversaries. He most likely participated in numerous conflicts, as demonstrated by his numerous wounds, and he displayed bravery by fighting relentlessly in battle. Gothmog was absolutely obedient to Sauron and the Witch King of Angmar. He did, however, display dread as the Rohirrim charged at him, despite literally being bred for battle. Khamûl. In Middle-earth, Khamûl was one of the 9 ring-wraiths, second only to the Witch King. He served as Sauron's lieutenant at Dol Guldur during the Third Age. He also briefly served as the Lord of Nazgûl when the Witch King was killed. Khamûl was referred to as the Black Easterling, the second chief, and the Shadow of the East. While alive, Khamûl was an Easterling king of Rhûn. The Dark Lord Sauron gave him one of the 9 rings of power, and over time he corrupted him and made him into one of his servants. In SA 2251, he first showed up as a member of the Nazgûl. 3 Nazgûl were then dispatched by Sauron to stay in Dol Guldur in TA 2951, and Khamûl then took control of the castle. In fact, it was the ringwraith known as Khamûl that pursued the hobbits to the Bucklebury Ferry in the Shire, and who, just before Frodo Baggins departed Hobbiton, asked Farmer Maggot for Baggins. Along with the other Nazgûl, Khamûl participated in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, riding a fellbeast and slaying Gondor's men at the outset of the conflict. He and the other 7 lesser Nazgûl fled to Mordor after the Witch King's death. Khamûl thereafter rose to become the Nazgûl's leader. Before the eagles attacked them, he rode his fellbeast with them to the Battle of the Black Gate. When Sauron realized that Frodo had taken the One Ring for himself, the Nazgûl withdrew and were sent to Mount Doom. In the end, he was burned in the eruption's blaze. Hammerhorns. In the Hobbit poem Errantry, a type of winged insect called a hammerhorn is mentioned. They resemble the Dumbledore insect family in appearance and nature. In numerous supplements, hammerhorns are characterized as violent insectoid beings that weigh 6 to 8 pounds and resemble enormous black and grey wasps. These supplements also provide other facts about hammerhorns, like they're supposed to be closely related to Dumbledore's, another type of winged insect. However, nothing more is known about them because even the facts or mentions of the hammerhorns are quite vague. Mewlips. The sole recorded mention of the Mewlips was in a poem written by the Shire's hobbits. They were a weird and secretive malevolent species. Their identity is a mystery, and they might not even exist. Alternatively, they might be a faded folkloric memory of the hobbits. They were rumored to be terrible creatures who lived in the shadows and ate naive travelers who went looking for them. Although it's unclear exactly what kind of creatures they were, they do appear to have had at least slightly human-like features and could be seen as a misunderstood amalgam of orcs and trolls. They're claimed to have eaten bystanders and collected their bones in sacks while living beyond the Murloc Mountains and the Toad Marsh. They otherwise keep to themselves in dark, damp caves where they sit and count their wealth. Notably, another reference to these horrifying cannibalistic beasts lurking in a swamp appears in Tolkien's poem The Mewlips. They have also been represented in adaptations as undead creatures residing in marshes and swamps. The idea that Morgoth invented the race during the Elder Days has also been put forth. Nazgul. The Black Riders and the Nine are the other names for the Nazgul, which is black speech for ring wraiths. They were the feared ring servants of the Dark Lord Sauron who lived in Minas Morgul and Dol Guldur in the latter years of the Third Age in Middle-earth. Their story goes as follows. Celebrimbor created the 19 Rings of Power in Eregion. All of them were taken by Sauron, despite being hidden in one of Eregion's safes. 9 of them were given to powerful lords and soldiers of men. Through his control of the rings, Sauron was able to taint the mighty 9. These 9 benefited greatly from the rings' power, wealth and prestige, but over time, the rings continue to have a corrupting effect. The rings eventually turned their wearers into wraiths, unseen to everyone else, and subjected them to Sauron's whims. Through the One Ring, the Nazgul's lives and abilities were tied to Sauron's, and as he increased or decreased in power, so did they. 1,000 years prior to the downfall, 3 of the ring wraiths may have been among the first and most influential Númenóreans to be corrupted by Sauron. They admired Sauron and were drawn into his schemes by their desire for knowledge or power. Only 2 of the 9 were ever given names, Khamûl the Easterling and the Witch King of Angmar. The 9 appeared for the first time in the Second Age in around 2251, and they quickly rose to prominence as Sauron's main aides. Little is known about their actions throughout the Second Age, despite their immense strength and status as Sauron's agents. After Sauron was defeated in the War of the Last Alliance in SA 3434, they were momentarily scattered. Both the Nazgul and Sauron were able to endure as long as the rings survived, despite no longer being able to maintain physical form, just as Sauron was after losing the One Ring. Daggers and long steel swords were among the weaponry carried by the Nazgul. Additionally, their leader had a strong black mace. However, they had more than just lethal weapons in their inventory. They also had terrifying voices that inspired fear in the hearts of mortals and an air of universal dread. They had improved hearing and smell, and they wore hauberks instead of silver mail. All living things were influenced by the aura of fear that enveloped them. This aura, which they termed the Black Breath, could poison anybody unlucky enough to approach them. One of the 9's biggest advantages was the fear they instilled in people. The 9 saw shadowy shapes throughout the daytime in comparison to mortal vision. They were most dreaded at night because they saw shapes and forms that were unseen to mortal eyes. They might more keenly feel the presence of people, and their presence could be perceived as a disturbing of the heart. In carrying out their duties, they were particularly sensitive to the ring's presence and were drawn to it, especially when it was worn by someone. Nazgul horses. The Nazgul rode black horses with ferocious crimson eyes during their era as the Black Riders. They largely performed the seeing function for the ring wraiths, who were frequently unable to see anything more than hazy forms. They were most likely Rohirrim horses when it came to their origins. When the orcs from Mordor carried out their raids over Anduin to steal horses, they always chose the black horses. Few of such are now left, Éomer reportedly told Aragorn. The only reason the horses could withstand the dark ring-wraith Nazgul near them, Gandalf once remarked to Frodo, was because the Dark Lord in Mordor had bred and raised these horses specifically for his service. Thus, it's very likely that orcs have stolen the majority of Rohan's black horses over the years. They were subsequently paired with one another in Mordor, increasing the likelihood that their offspring would be black. When the Nazgul set out to find Frodo and the ring, this and future generations ended up as serving as their mounts. As a result, the 9 relied heavily on their black horses, which were descended from horses kidnapped from Rohan for transportation at the beginning of the War of the Ring. The Black Riders lost their horses, however, when they perished in the flood following their fight with Glorfindel at the ford of Bruinen. The Nazgul then got winged animals from Sauron in addition to new horses as they returned on foot to Mordor to reorganize. The 9 assaulted the abandoned city of Osgiliath with these flying fell beasts to make room for a siege of Minas Tirith. The Nazgul then utilized the fell beasts to their advantage in all missions and conflicts from then on. Oathbreakers. The pre-Númenórean people known as the Oathbreakers, often also referred to as the Dead Men of Dunharrow, lived in the White Mountains at first, but were cursed by Isildur to stay there until their oath was upheld by Aragorn. They shared ancestry with the Dunlendings and the Haleth people. Before Gondor was founded, during the Dark Years they had worshipped Sauron. At the Stone of Erech on the Hill of Erech, shortly after Gondor was established in the closing years of the Second Age, their king vowed allegiance to Isildur. Isildur ordered the men of the mountains to keep their promise and fight beside him in the battle against their ancient leader when Sauron reappeared and gained strength. However, they violated their oath by declining to side with the last alliance. Isildur's response was to curse them with a prophecy that the fight with Sauron would extend for an indefinite amount of time and that they would be called upon once more before the end, as well as a curse that they would not be allowed to rest until their oath was completed. The men of the mountains hid in the caverns to escape Isildur's anger, lost touch with other men, and gradually diminished in number. The Hill of Erech and all other locations where the men of the mountains had stayed were later overrun by the wraiths of the sleepless dead. In times of distress and impending death, the dead men came to the valley of Harrowdale, which was in the mountain shadow, and compelled the locals to lock themselves in their homes out of terror. The dead men also haunted the caves beneath the Dwimorberg. The people living close to the Hill of Erech were likewise terrified by the wraiths of the dead, because they knew that the King of the Dead was in charge of the wraiths' army. Nevertheless, in the end, they found salvation. When Isildur's heir, Aragorn, came across the dead in the Paths of the Dead during the War of the Ring, he ordered the dead to let them pass and to come with him to the Stone of Erech. Once there, Aragorn gave the Oathbreakers the order to follow him to Pelargir, and said that their pledge would be considered completed once all of Sauron's followers had been expelled from the region. The allies of Sauron were thus chased away by the dead, who finally fulfilled their vow. In exchange for their assistance, Aragorn viewed their oath at Pelargir's strand of the river Anduin as fulfilled, and they were at last at peace. Oikoroi and Tevildo. Oikoroi was a strong warrior cat that served Tevildo, the Lord of Cats, in earlier iterations of J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium. It's said that he was killed by the wolfhound Huan. In Beren and Luthien and other early sections of Tolkien's Legendarium, Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, was the mightiest cat possessed of an evil spirit and the closest ally of Morgoth. He was also the most powerful cat. Tevildo was described as having blood-red eyes and being as black as the starless night. Apparently, Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, had cast a spell on his cat servants, making them enormous, absolutely savage and lethal. Oikoroi and Umuyan were two of Tevildo's most well-known servants. Tevildo also received a supernatural collar made of gold that increased his power in addition to his enormous size. Later, Huan, a hound from Valinor, stole his collar. Huan then made Tevildo give up the spells Morgoth had used to charm Tevildo's cat minions in exchange for Huan not killing him. The cat's spell was broken by it, and they, but not Tevildo, grew back to their original size. When he discovered that the cats had betrayed him, Morgoth was incensed. Quite the odd characters, but if you love cats, also kind of cool nonetheless. Old Man Willow. Old Man Willow in the Old Forest was a willow tree that was situated close to Withywindle. Given that the Old Forest was formerly a part of the same primordial forest as Fangorn, he might have been an Ent who had evolved into a tree-like creature, or even a Huorn, one of a living race of ancient slow-moving trees. Much of the forest's animosity against walking things originated from the Great Willow, which had an evil heart. Despite his strength, Tom Bombadil, who called the evil being Old Grey Willow Man, controlled him and to the extent that he could or was willing to, restrained the evil. Old Man Willow lulls Tom Bombadil to sleep and imprisons him in a gap according to the poem The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. He then reprimands Tom for spying on him and teasing him with his feather. However, Old Man Willow also instantly releases him after receiving Tom's order to do so. But Tom isn't the only creature he troubles. On September 26th, TA 3018, Old Man Willow used a charm to make the hobbits drowsy. While Frodo sat on a root to dangle his feet in a river and fell asleep, Merry and Pippin rested their heads against the tree trunk. The tree dropped Frodo into the stream and imprisoned Merry and Pippin in crevices in the trunk. Sam was able to break the spell and pull Frodo out of the stream. They tried to start a fire at the base of the tree to try and save Merry and Pippin, but this just enraged Old Man Willow, who vowed to kill the stranded hobbits. However, when Tom Bombadil arrived just in time and had the melody for him, they were saved. Silent Watchers. On the southeast side of the Tower of Cirith Ungol, protecting the gate, were two three-headed phantom sculptures known as the Two Watchers. On either side of the entryway, the Two Watchers, two magnificent figures, were seated on thrones. They had 3 bodies, heads and vulture-like features with black stone eyeballs for their eyes. 1 head was turned inward, 1 was turned outward, and the 3rd was turned to face the actual gateway. Some dreadful spirit of evil vigilance resided within them, and they were thus sentient. They noticed every living thing, whether it was apparent or not. They were capable of recognizing foes, preventing them from passing through the gate with the force of their will alone, and raising an alarm if their guard was breached. The creator of these statues is unknown, but given their wicked aura and demeanor, it's most likely to be Sauron. The hobbit Samwise Gamgee visited the tower to save his companion and master Frodo Baggins during the quest to destroy the One Ring. Sam had to use the Phial of Galadriel to get past the Watchers because his willpower was insufficient to escape their terrifying trap. However, once he had done so, the Watchers let out a horrific cry, and an alarm bell rang in the tower to let the orcs inside know that someone had entered. After helping Frodo, Sam managed to leave the tower using the Phial once more. As the 2 hobbits walked by the Watchers, the archway fell behind them, and a Nazgul crouched down on the damaged gate and cried out in a terrifying manner. Nothing escaped the detection of the silent Watchers. Snagga, Lesser Orcs. Snagga was a derogatory term for the weaker orcs of Mordor and Isengard that was most frequently used by the bigger and more powerful Uruk-hai. It derives from a black speech word that means slave or servant. In various Slavic languages, including Serbian, Croatian and Bosnian, Snagga also happens to imply strong. The Lord of the Rings features 2 orcs by the name of Snagga. Snagga, Orc of Isengard, and Snagga, Orc of Mordor. Thuringwithil. During the First Age, Thuringwithil, a female Maya who assumed the form of a vampire, served Sauron in Tol Gawroth as well as Morgoth. By the time of the Silmaril quest, Thuringwithil, Sauron's herald, was based in Tol Gawroth. She was most likely killed there during the conflict between Huan the Hound and Sauron. At Tol Gawroth, she acted as a courier or herald for Sauron. Although her origins weren't revealed, her capacity to assume different forms suggests that she was a Maya. She was said to have iron claws and fingered wings. Woman of Secret Shadow, or Woman of Hidden Shadow, are glossed versions of the name. It's the Lay of Leithian that contains the first appearance of Thuringwithil in the Legendarium. And, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.